everybody. It's time for the Silver Bullets podcast. I am Michael Citro.
And I'm Chip Minnich.
Chip, it's been a couple of weeks since we've talked. Ohio State has played a game, sort of, a spring game anyway. I know you and your family typically go to that, and we can talk about that in a bit. We have a little bit of basketball stuff to discuss, but of course the top story at this hour would be the breaking news that just kind of came out an hour and a half or so before we sat down to start recording this, and that is that Matthew Baldwin, quarterback at Ohio State, has entered or is about to enter the transfer portal. That is not ideal if you're Ohio State.
Not whatsoever. Everything, based on what I've read in the time since that news broke, we haven't heard anything from Matthew Baldwin himself in terms of his reasoning, but everything that I've been able to glean online is that this is more to do with wanting to be closer to home. Being from Texas, I guess there's a desire to be closer to home, and the likelihood that Justin Fields is going to be the starting quarterback probably is making this decision a little easier, but it certainly is not the kind of news that any Ohio State fan was hoping to read or hear about just a few days after the spring game.
Yeah, it was interesting. They are saying that this is a kid who has not shied away from quarterback battles in the past, and that this is something where he wants to go home. But the timing of it is very curious, considering he's not any closer or farther from home than he was when, say, for example, Tate Martell transferred.
I agree. And what's kind of interesting is that if the homesickness was such an issue, I would have figured he could have made that declaration right after the Rose Bowl and transferred then. And now, granted, Ohio State would still be in dire straits, but at least they would have had maybe some kind of an opportunity within that aforementioned transfer portal to get somebody in for spring ball. So now Ohio State goes into the fall camp with Chris Chuganoff as the backup, and all the indications are that Ohio State will be very active in the transfer portal again to try and bring some more depth to that quarterback room.
Chip, who is the current quarterback at Scottsdale College in Arizona?
Well, we know, unfortunately, that Joe Germain exhausted his eligibility, but that would be great if Joey G still had some magic eligibility and some magic left in the arm. I'm as puzzled by this one as you or anyone else that might be listening to this podcast. I think, like I said, I'm not going to judge Matthew Baldwin because I did read something online, like I said a few moments ago, that this seems that this was not something that just came out of the blue, that this has been something that has kind of been building up, this desire to be closer to home. But it's going to be interesting to see the different possible names that Ohio State will be linked to between now and the beginning of fall camp, which, it'll be here before you know it. I mean, that's usually going to be the end of July, beginning of August for Ohio State to begin fall camp. So we have to kind of cross our fingers that Ryan Day and his coaching staff have a pretty good idea about some of the available quarterbacks that might be interested in coming to Ohio State.
Yeah, Chip, is it too late for Tate Martell to transfer back to Ohio State?
It's not too late for Tate Martell, but all the indications, I'm not trying to take shots at Tate Martell. I guess that for all of I know we're going to talk about the spring game in greater detail in a little bit, but for all of the hand-wringing that Ohio State fans had about the performance of Ohio State's quarterbacks during the spring game, I guess Tate Martell during a scrimmage did not necessarily inspire a great deal of confidence from the Miami Hurricane faithful. So, it's not too late for Tate to reconsider, but no, I think that ship has sailed down to Coral Gables.
Yes, it has. It's if this has been growing for some time, it really is a curious timing that he made it all the way through the spring game before asking to enter the transfer portal. It's a very makes it very difficult to believe that this is actually related to homesickness, but maybe it is. I'm not gonna, I can't judge. I can only look at the optics of the situation and say the optics don't really look good for Matthew Baldwin in this situation.
They don't, and I think Gerd had before we started recording the podcast, Gerd was posting some things on Twitter about previous conversations he had with Matthew Baldwin about not shying away from competition and certainly wanting to play. And you would, regardless of position, any of these young men, they want to play. That's just human nature. They're competitive. It's just, I'm just kind of stammering for words because it is kind of very confusing as to why, only a few days after the spring game, after being told that the competition for the starting quarterback position was still ongoing. And as you and I know, as any knowledgeable Ohio State fan knows, you're only one play away from being that starter. If anything, that was going to be something that when we talk about the spring game, that it was certainly going to be my sincere hope that Coach Day and the offensive coaches were going to give Matthew Baldwin considerable playing time in those opening games because of the fact that both Justin Fields and Matthew Baldwin were so tremendously inexperienced that it would behoove the entire team to have both quarterbacks get as much playing time as possible in the event that Justin Fields were to go down to injury.
There's no doubt Matthew Baldwin would have gotten some playing time this year, injury or not. If you had any kind of lead in the fourth quarter, that a substantial lead, Matthew Baldwin was going to get snaps then at the very least, and that's if he didn't get any earlier in the game. The team is left with now with Justin Fields. He just won the job. If he hadn't earlier, it's his for sure. Now, Chris Chugunov, as you mentioned, is the backup. He's the only other scholarship quarterback on the roster. So Chugs could get some snaps this year. And then there's Danny Vanadsky, a sophomore. It's the cupboard's kind of bare. It makes you almost think maybe a guy like Trevon Grimes shouldn't have transferred, or something like that. Who was the other kid from Florida that was a quarterback in high school that transferred out and ended up, I think, going to JUCO, and now I think he's in the Canadian Football League. Oh,
I know. I'm drawing a blank. But yeah, it's the kind of thing where I think the transfer portal, if anything, it is shown that I think of all the positions, quarterback is going to be the most volatile. Unfortunately, Ohio State is now kind of, bearing the brunt of that. But I think I think the transfer portal is here to stay. And I think if players don't necessarily see a clear window to playing time and or when they are going to start, the option to enter that transfer portal is going to be readily available. And I just think we're kind of in the wild, wild west of free agency as it relates to transfers, because it just seems that, just think about, when it's, 5 years ago, and it seems like, it was just yesterday, but 5 years ago, going into fall camp, you had somebody as talented as Braxton Miller as the presumed starter. And then going into fall camp, Cardale Jones was the backup, and it was midway through camp that JT Barrett was able to overtake Cardale Jones as the primary backup. Mm-hmm. And then, as we all know, the magical conclusion to that season, all three of them, not only sitting on that dais after the national championship, but all of them saying that they were going to stick around. And it just seems completely far-fetched nowadays that the idea of all these talented players would be patient and willing to stick around if they don't have the opportunity to play as much as they believe they should.
Mm-hmm. The kid I was trying to think of was Torrance Gibson.
Oh gosh, Torrance Gibson. There's another star-crossed individual. But yeah, he's making his money, I think, for the Edmonton Eskimos.
Yes.
I think he signed with Edmonton.
Yeah, not long ago.
not long ago.
So, yeah, if Gibson had come in and redshirted as a freshman in 2015, he would be potentially the backup this year as a senior. So,
yeah.
You missed the boat, Torrance. Sorry.
Yes, you did. But he's
man.
making that big coin up in Edmonton then.
Yeah, so. It's probably about as much. It's probably worth about as much as American dollars now, or more.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I remember we used to make jokes when we were kids, or not even kids, like in college. The Canadian money was like, the transfer or the exchange rate was ridiculous. You'd be like, yeah, Canadian money was kind of sort of a punchline at times, but now it's not. The things have shifted a little bit over the years, but it's certainly a dilemma for Ryan Day. He's going to have to scour that portal, transfer portal. I mean, this is a case where maybe there's a kid out there somewhere who was thinking they might transfer but didn't pull the trigger. Maybe now that they've got an opportunity at Ohio State, maybe now's the time to enter that transfer portal.
It's possible. I mean, I just know up until a few days ago, the most, I don't want to say the most popular name, but the name that I was most familiar with, and I think a lot of Ohio State fans were familiar with, was Tommy Stevens, entered the transfer portal from Penn State. And he was somebody that Ohio State, I think prior to be fair to Coach Day, Tommy Stevens was recruited by Ohio State, but that might have been because of, with Urban Meyer and the idea of that, truly athletic quarterback. That might have been, why, he looked at that depth chart at the time that Ohio State had, and decided, I have a clearer path to playing time at Penn State, because I know Penn State used him not only just as a quarterback, but kind of like a utility player. Like he was a wide receiver and all these kind of things. So maybe I'm not suggesting that, to beg Tommy Stevens, but the fact that with Justin Fields displaying his mobility with the zone read and the spring game, and that, Tommy? Maybe he might be a viable candidate. That's just a name that I'm familiar with and that I know is in the transfer portal now. Again, he may have clear sights on another destination that is completely unknown.
Right, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Tommy Stevens, Ohio State fans will remember as the guy who Penn State tried a few trick plays early in the game against Ohio State last year and flubbed them really horribly wrong. Trace McSorley couldn't get the ball out to him, and I don't know that they turned the ball over. They came close to at least once.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. He did. They tried to pitch it back to Tommy Stevens, and I think the pitch was bad, and it resulted in a loss of yardage and things like that. So
yeah, they were going for the old trick play there, wing it back to Stevens and let him find the guy down the field. And with Ohio State's coverage last year, it probably would have been a big play, but didn't execute before to get it to Stevens. But yeah, that'd be an intriguing name because he is a dual threat guy, and I think, as we start to sort of shift toward talking about the spring game, I think I noticed a big difference in the play calling when Matthew Baldwin was on the field as opposed to when Justin Fields was out there.
I agree with that completely, and that was going to be a compliment to Coach Day, and I mean this with no disrespect to Urban Meyer. He did win a national championship for Ohio State, as I said, 5 years ago. He won two previous ones. But it certainly seemed that Urban Meyer was completely beholden to his offensive philosophy and did not want to deviate from it. With the idea I mentioned, for example, with Cardale Jones being named the starter at the beginning of the 2015 season, and making Cardale Jones try to run that zone read offense that really was ill-suited to Jones's talent. You're absolutely right. I think with Justin Fields, I said this before on a previous podcast, so I'll just reiterate it. I think just from first glance, being in the stadium and then having had the opportunity to rewatch the game on a DVR, that Justin Fields, we will see more of an offense that will look more like what Ohio State ran with J.T. Barrett and Braxton Miller with kind of the zone read. And that's not to say that Ohio State's not going to throw the ball, but I think considering Justin Fields' inexperience, as I said, I think leaning on that running game, especially now, based on the news of Matthew Baldwin, I think leaning on the running game is going to be paramount. And getting back to the point about tailoring the offense to the players' need or strengths, when Matthew Baldwin was in the game, it certainly seemed like more of a drop-back passing attack.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the quarterback room shapes up entering the fall, or when we get to fall. Right now there's plenty of chairs to go around for Justin Fields and Danny Vanansky and Chugs in that quarterback room. They can have their pick of whatever chair they want. It's interesting with this offensive-minded staff with Ryan Day and Jurkic, the quarterbacks are all leaving. But I mean, that's the way it goes.
Yeah, like I said, I just think it's that transfer portal has kind of made it a little bit more of I don't want to say an enticing option, but I think a very realistic option that somebody can go and be declared immediately eligible at their next destination. Whereas in previous years, if you declared, you had to sit out that year. I mean, I think the players are just kind of weighing that, and that's why you see so many people taking advantage of that opportunity.
Yeah, it's certainly much easier than it was back in the day. I mean, transfers back then were nearly unheard of. Nobody wanted to sit out that year, and it was. I think the first high-profile quarterback transfer I can remember would be Jeff George, maybe.
That's a good point. We're talking that was back in the late 80s, and even then, Jeff George, he had to sit out, and I may be mistaken, but I think he wasn't even allowed to be on scholarship since he had transferred within the Big Ten, going from Purdue to Illinois.
Yeah, that sounds right. That was that was a long time ago.
I was going to say that's got to be that's well over 30 years ago, because Jeff George, he played for Purdue for a year and then transferred after his freshman year. So I want to say that he played for 2 years at Illinois, and then that was also that 1990 NFL draft. That was the first year that juniors could declare early for the NFL draft. So I know Jeff George was the number one pick that year. Mm-hmm. So we're talking, at least over 30 years ago. Like it would have been 30 years ago that Jeff George was playing for Illinois in the 1989 season.
Yeah. Well, Jeff George, by the way, is 51 years old.
And I bet you he could still sling the pill like nobody's business.
I bet he could throw it farther than I can. I'll just say that. Chip, the spring game, let's turn our attention toward that. 61,102 fans in Ohio Stadium for the Grays' victory over Scarlet 35-17. How many of the 61,102 fans were members of the Minnich family?
I had my 3 children and myself, so there's 4, and then related to the Minnich family, I had my wife's cousin, John, who had made his spring game debut last year, and he enjoyed it so much he wanted to come down. And then John brought his son Connor, and then my nephew Sam. So if you want to consider them auxiliary members of the Minnich family, that would bring the Minnich total was 7.
I see. So without you guys, there would not even have been 61,100 fans.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. We do our part.
Now, I missed the very, very beginning of the broadcast. Was there a circle drill?
There was, and it wasn't nearly as prolonged as Coach Meyer used to do during his tenure.
Well, it's amazing they even do it at all with the limited amount of contact that they have at the spring game now. It's funny because it actually used to be a football game. The quarterbacks were live, and you could actually tackle them. And somewhere along the line, people figured out we probably don't want to get guys hurt, so let's not do that anymore.
And I'm gonna cut Coach Day some slack on that. I know a lot of fans are disappointed at the lack of contact and the lack of tackling and the whole thud thing. But looking at Ohio State, as you said, that going into the spring and leaving the spring, that, for example, certain positions like the offensive line, the depth is a considerable concern going into the fall camp. And the last thing in the world you want is any kind of extended opportunity for any player to get hurt. Same thing, like the fact that, we're talking about the quarterbacks used to be live. I see nothing wrong with, the idea of, like the two-hand touch or the thud mentality that Coach Day, because there's going to be plenty of opportunity for tackling during fall camp. And you and I both know that all it would take is for Coach Day to have a player, it doesn't matter what position, running back, wide receiver, get injured, and all of a sudden the critics come out of everywhere saying, why are they tackling in the spring game? So, kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. I'm going to side with Coach Day here on the side of being cautious and safe.
Yeah, I don't fault him for it. The amazing part of it is how long it went on as a normal football game. For years and years, it was a normal tackle football game, and you got your star players out earlier, but still it was still live hitting, and you can't tell a guy like Chris Spielman not to hit someone hard. It's just not going to happen. He's gonna do his thing. So guys like him or Antoine Winfield, guys like that, they would hit just as hard back then in a spring game as they would in a regular game. But once again, the Scarlet team set up for failure by Ohio State's powers that be. So my dream of a Scarlet championship went awry yet again this year. Still not sure why people root for the Gray team, but Gray wins. But it was an interesting game from a perspective as we wanted to see how much of the old Ryan Day offense would stay. What kind of things we would see that were a little bit different. I think we saw a little bit of different types of quarterback runs. I think we saw, and again, it's hard to really take anything too much out of it because, you might see a few plays that don't look familiar, but you haven't seen anywhere near what we're going to see in the fall in terms of the final product. So they're still installing it. Guys are still learning it. And I just felt like that was interesting. I'm going to start out with one guy that stood out to me, and then maybe you and I can just kind of take turns talking about some of the guys who stood out. And I think we'll start on the defensive side of the ball. And I'll leave Joss and Wint to you. I'm going to say a guy who stood out for me that I didn't expect to stand out was Amir Reep. I thought Amir Reep had a really strong spring game.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought up Amir Reep. I'm just looking at the notes that since you and I didn't correspond about players that we wanted to talk about, he is certainly one that he had that impressive interception. I think he is certainly primed to play more than he has his previous two seasons. I know he's been a contributor primarily on special teams, but I think he certainly showed well in the spring game with that interception, and I think he's going to be in the rotation much more so in the fall.
Yeah, I mean, I was really impressed by his coverage skills. They tried to go at him a few times even before the interception, and he had really, really tight coverage there. And I thought that he played really well. I think if you look at the two deep as far as defensive backs, I saw competent defensive back play from the two deep all across the board, and that's not something that we saw a lot of last year.
No, we did not. I think you're being very polite and kind when you say that. But certainly I feel better about the defense. And just to reiterate what you said a moment ago, that Ohio State didn't really show too much offensively. The fact is, I don't care if we're talking Ryan Day, if we're talking Urban Meyer, if we're talking Jim Tressel. Secretly, every every head coach, I don't care if we're talking Ohio State or anywhere in the country, while they talk about how great it is to have a spring game, secretly deep down inside, they hate the idea of a spring game because they're afraid of somebody getting hurt. And all they want to do is they just want to finish up their spring and get out of there without any injuries, as well as not show too much, because nowadays with spring games, with the advent of the Big Ten Network, this is something that's available on television. So now, any of the upcoming opponents can look at, well, I don't want to show anything that I've been working on throughout the spring in the spring game. I want to kind of hold that close to the vest. So getting back to the idea of defensive improvement, I certainly felt that just from the alignment side of things that Ohio State looked much better than they did all of 2018.
Absolutely. So I already told you that I would leave Jocelyn Wint for you. I don't think anybody saw that performance coming that watched Jocelyn Wint play last year. But it turns out that Jocelyn Wint's status in terms of his recruitment and what kind of an athlete he was and wherever he was ranked in his stars and all that, it turns out that might not be might not have been off base.
No, I had Jocelyn Wint written down. He was one of those people that I think certainly took advantage of the opportunity in the spring game. We've been talking about Matthew Baldwin now. The idea of some of Jocelyn Wint, how much of it is Wint's improvement, how much of some of the passes that Matthew Baldwin was throwing were a little high, that Jocelyn Wint was taking advantage of. But I certainly agree that Jocelyn Wint looked much better than he did than anything that we saw in 2018. I think the change in defensive coaches, thus the opportunity to kind of come in with if you want to think of it like a clean slate in comparison to what may have been if the previous defensive coaches had stayed on staff. I think he certainly took advantage of that. I certainly agree with Gerd and Tom Orr, our colleagues at the Ozone, that it seems like Jocelyn Wint has you can make a legitimate argument that Jocelyn Wint is going to settle in on the depth chart at that bullet position. Not that you saw too much of that in the spring game, but you could make a legitimate point that I can see why he is second on the depth chart behind Brendan White, because he certainly played very well in the spring game.
He really did, and it was good to see sort of almost a redemption arc for Jocelyn Wint, who was understandably blamed for a lot of the defense's problems last year. He finished with 4 tackles in the spring game and the 2 interceptions and a pass breakup. Amir Reep had 4 tackles as well with an assist, so 4.5 tackles for him and an interception that he ran back 25 yards, I think. It was a good day for those guys. Who else stood out for you defensively? I'm going to say that Jean-Baptiste flashed a little bit. I think there was at least one really nice play by, I want to say Tyreek Johnson. I get my Tyreeks confused, but where coming off the edge, I might be wrong on that. It was Tyreek Smith, actually. It was Tyreek Smith. Mm-hmm. So Smith came on. He really timed the snap count really well, to the point where I had to see the replay to make sure he wasn't offside, but he actually did time it well. So I thought he flashed for me, and maybe just a little bit of a flash for me for Noah Potter. But other than that, kind of what you'd really expect from a spring game.
And I'll tell you what, I want to compliment you, my man, because I'm sitting here listening to you talk about these players that impressed you, and I had all 3 of them written down to discuss. Javonte Jean-Baptiste. I also had Tyreek Smith as well as Noah Potter. I guess just to be, I don't want somebody who seemed to be a little bit more active in the on the defensive line. And reemphasizing the fact that it is the spring game. Antoine Jackson, saw him, on screen more so than I saw like actually during the game. But I saw him pursuing. So I think, everyone that you mentioned, I think, like Noah Potter, it remains to be seen how much he will play with that stacked defensive line. Knowing Coach Johnson, he'll certainly have him ready to play. It really remains to be seen how many opportunities he's going to get. Noah Potter may certainly be one of those people that takes advantage of that 4-game freshman redshirt rule that was implemented last year, and for good reason. No reason to burn up a year of eligibility unless necessary. But certainly Tyreek Smith, he timed that one sack very, very well. Hopefully Coach Johnson has kind of told him to cool his jets, so to speak, in a regular game, instead of jumping off sides, because it did certainly seem like, man, it was that well timed, but he might not get that same opportunity against the opposition. And Javonte Jean-Baptiste, everything that I was led to believe was, this guy was just, as thin as a rail coming into 2018, and it certainly looks like that body by Maradi has paid off. That he certainly looks ready and able to contribute as a redshirt freshman in 2019, because he was all over the place.
Were you disappointed that Zach Harrison didn't really show?
I was a little disappointed simply because of the black stripe had been removed, and so it just kind of made me think, okay, well, he must be coming on because of that whole tradition that Ohio State has with the black stripe. But by the same token, I think it's probably, and this is just maybe my opinion, I think it might be good as an Ohio State fan that he didn't really show, because I think the expectations, we talked about it previously, that considering he was so highly recruited and so highly touted, that fans are going to think, okay, well, we're going to have this guy coming in and he's going to pick up just where the Bosa brothers left off. And I think, okay, it might help that, as I said, the defensive end rotation is so strong that, I think Zach Harrison, he'll certainly play, but maybe the spring game, this will kind of help to temper some expectations of Zach Harrison going into 2019.
Yeah, that's a good point by you. I think that if any of our listeners are expecting another Bosa, please stop expecting another Bosa. The Bosa brothers are unicorns, essentially. It's amazing that we even had two of them.
Yes.
It's a lot to ask for the next guy to come in and put up those kind of numbers, especially as a freshman. And we have, Ohio State has other very talented players ahead of them, and they probably are not going to become Bosas either. So temper those expectations on the Bosa front. So, Chip, let's turn our attention to the offense. A little while ago, you mentioned those high throws from Matthew Baldwin. Well, I think there probably wasn't a better play in the spring game than one of those high throws by Matthew Baldwin, when Seven Banks was just camped out under it waiting for an interception. But Garrett Wilson said, nope, I'm going to take that, thank you very much, and a very acrobatic touchdown for the freshman.
Undoubtedly. And a moment ago I said about hopefully fans are going to temper their expectations of Zach Harrison. Conversely, when it comes to Garrett Wilson, it's that kind of play that fans, their expectations of Garrett Wilson, they're going to be quite high, and understandably so. That Garrett Wilson, he's coming in, and I certainly would be surprised if Garrett Wilson is not firmly within that wide receiver rotation, even despite the fact that you have players like Austin Mack coming back. You have, KJ Hill, you have Ben Victor, you have some other wide receivers that I'm sure that we'll talk about in a few moments. But Garrett Wilson is going to be in that rotation, that hopefully he continues to progress as a blocker, because we all know that that's so crucial within the Ohio State offensive attack, that any wide receiver, you have to do more besides just be able to catch the ball as Garrett Wilson so capably displayed in the spring game, being an effective blocker that is preeminent in Ohio State's offense. And from what I understand, that might be like one of the only things that Garrett Wilson is kind of struggling with, or is having challenges with, I should say. So the sooner he picks that up, the more playing time he will probably get.
Yeah, it's the toughest part of that isn't necessarily learning the techniques. It's that a lot of these freshmen come in and they need to put on muscle so that they can maintain those blocks. They come in and they've always been able to just outrun everybody, jump over everybody, and that kind of thing, and they didn't really have to block a whole lot. They come in, they learn the techniques and everything, but you have to be able to have the strength to make those blocks against junior and senior defensive backs, and sometimes even pick off a linebacker along the way. So, but Garrett Wilson is a guy I'm not a big recruiting guy. I don't have time to really get that deep into following it, but he's a guy who, when I saw his tape, stood out to me, a person that doesn't really spend a whole lot of time with recruiting, and he just looked so polished and so much already like a college receiver. And you don't typically see that even in highlight films of the top guys. You don't see, you basically see them showing off that they're so much more athletic than the other players on the field that are also high school players. But he showed things in his video that were, just really smart and veteran and savvy moves, and the ability to go high point a ball is something that a lot of young receivers don't really have down. And the touchdown, we saw it on that, and he also came very, very close to jumping over a defensive back down the field to catch a ball that was a little bit underthrown too.
Yeah, he's certainly the recruiting hype. I'm kind of in the same camp as you, that I really don't. And the whole like this guy was like this many stars compared to somebody else. I don't. I'm not saying that it's not worthwhile. I'm just saying I just don't really. My logic is, if Ohio State is going to offer a player, regardless of what position we're talking about, then Ohio State must have done their homework, and I'm trusting in the coaches who have and Mark Fantoni to have done their homework, and they know what they're doing, and they're going to develop that player. But Garrett Wilson certainly, for all of the recruiting accolades, it certainly looks well deserved.
Absolutely, it will be fun to follow Garrett Wilson's career if he stays out of the portal transfer. The transfer portal, I should say.
Oh, jeez, man, that would just be terrible.
So it was fun to watch him. Other receivers that flashed, obviously Ben Victor had a 98-yard touchdown. His I think he was being covered by a walk-on who fell down at the time. 98 yards, though, kind of sticks in your mind because it's the kind of play that teams had against Ohio State's defense last year. And Jalen Gill, it looked like they really wanted to go to him early. And weren't able to, but then they eventually started finding him in the second half, and he ended up with 95 yards on 7 catches. He led everybody in catches, and Victor led everybody in yards, mostly because of the 98-yarder. He only had 2 catches. The other one went for, about 15 yards, I think. Limited, we saw only, sparing glimpses of KJ Hill and Austin Mack, but it was really good to see Austin Mack back on the field after the injury that he sustained last year. And Chip, if you're looking for the tight end this year, the spring game did not give any hint that will be the case.
That is true. They out of the tight ends, a player who was recruited by Ohio State that has not played nearly as much is Jake Hausman, and he was targeted a few times, and along those lines, Ohio State, they were talking about. I think that they actually tried to hit Jeremy Ruckert once during the game, but you're absolutely correct. When it comes to the tight ends, they were not nearly as prominent as they probably will be in the fall. With Luke Farrell and Rashad Berry. As far as the receivers that you mentioned, certainly Jalen Gill had been the talk of the spring, along with Garrett Wilson, and it certainly showed why he is going to figure prominently in the offense in the fall. A couple other receivers that they also they kind of, I don't want to say that they're going to play considerably, but who knows? C.J. Saunders, who's a longtime fan favorite, he had his moments, and I think he has his certain niche, so to speak, that being that stereotypical slot receiver, I think he can certainly play. And a guy who has played hardly at all. Now, granted, it was primarily against probably like walk-ons, and it remains to be seen how much he'll play in the fall. Is Elijah Gardner? He was one of those from a couple years ago, a late addition to the recruiting class. His claim to fame was kind of, all right, well, I seem to recall Urban Meyer saying that he's raw, but he can run fast, and those are the kind of guys that we want to develop. I just kind of paraphrasing that, and he certainly showed on the opportunities when he did catch the ball that those traits. So it's the wide receivers. We all know that Ohio State lost a lot of talent, a lot of experience. Going into 2019, that it's going to be incumbent upon those players who are returning to play well, but certainly the opportunity for these unproven players behind them to kind of seize the moment and try and rise up the depth chart. Yeah,
I don't know that there's a lot of need for us to talk too much about the quarterback battle since Matthew Baldwin's going to transfer.
It's done. Done.
He played a lot more, had a lot more attempts. He played for both teams in the game, and I think he ended up something like 20 of 36 with 2 interceptions. So he had a little bit better numbers, but he also a little more careless with the ball than Justin Fields. You would expect Justin Fields to not look good after having only been with the program for a couple of months. And 4 of 13 wasn't something I was terribly worried about. He showed his arm strength. He showed that he can be accurate. He did take 4 sacks, but I think part of that is the two-hand touch situation, and part of it is kind of being focused in on that first or second option, maybe not not really reacting so much, not really reacting naturally and trying to think too much. And I think that will get better as he progresses. But the one thing that I really was impressed by was his, the way they used him in the running game a little bit. His ability to extend plays was amazing, and there was a couple of there was one that I think they blew for two-hand touch that there's no way he would have been down on, and he would have taken it to the house. But he looks like he's going to be very dynamic, and he's going to be very Braxton-esque at times, I think.
And I happened to see, before we started recording the podcast, somebody had showing my age, showing just knowing we're kind of comparable. Somebody had a meme of Han Solo encased in carbonite, saying what the Ohio State coaching staff is going to be doing to Justin Fields between now and the summer, just to make sure that he doesn't get hurt, because all of the collective eggs are in the Justin Fields basket, so to speak. The possibility of Ohio State, their season. I mean, it so much. We have no idea in terms of between now and when toe meets leather on August 31st against Florida Atlantic, but it's going to be the offense is going to be firmly and squarely upon Justin Fields' shoulders, and it's going to be so important that Ohio State does everything that they can to keep him healthy and maximize his skills.
Mm-hmm. No pressure, Justin.
None.
No pressure. Yeah, and when they do encase him in carbonite, they have to make sure that they unfreeze him in plenty of time for his vision to return, because as you recall, Han Solo couldn't see real well after the he was released. So
that's correct.
But what did you make of the way they used the quarterback run in that game? It wasn't necessarily, and we may see a return of it, but it wasn't necessarily the zone read type of runs. There were a lot of different things. There were sort of like there was like a quarterback sweep type thing. There was that goal line thing where you just let him sprint to the corner. And there was the one play around the left side, the one I was talking about earlier, where for sure if it was a tackle and he was a live quarterback, he would have scored on it, because I was questioning whether the guy even touched him with two hands on the play.
No, I certainly think I've mentioned like the idea of like the zone read. I think that's going to be a part of it, but I also think they're going to. I keep going back to it. I think especially now with the news of Matthew Baldwin, I think the coaching staff, they're going to collectively huddle and figure out with Justin Fields what are the things that he can do best and try to design the offense to his strengths. And if that incorporates the zone read, so be it. But like you said, like the idea of, some of the different running plays that you described, I think those will certainly be part of the playbook. I am really convinced that the running game is going to be, somewhere Woody Hayes is going to be smiling. I think in 2019, I think the running game is going to be the primary method of attack, and especially as Justin Fields tries to get acclimated to that Ohio State offense. As you said, he's only been on campus since late December. He's only had officially 15 practices. So for all of the hype about his recruiting status, I think a lot of people are forgetting. Yeah, he played at Georgia, but I may be mistaken. I seem to recall that when he played at Georgia, not only he didn't play a lot, but I think he only threw the ball like 39 times. It's not as though Justin Fields is coming in as this grizzled veteran, so to speak. He certainly is lacking in experience. So I certainly believe that the coaching staff is going to try to put him in maximum opportunities to succeed running the ball. How they decide to do that, I think the zone read will certainly be a part of it. I'm not as familiar with what kind of offense he ran in high school, but I would venture a guess that Justin Fields certainly had a lot of liberality in being able to, kind of showcase his talents.
Yeah, the running game, it's interesting you brought up the Woody Hayes thing. The running game was surprisingly effective for a spring game, especially considering there were some tackles, but there was still a lot of two-hand touch, especially for guys like J.K. Dobbins. But Master Teague had a really nice game, and Marcus Crowley had a pretty good game, and then sort of at garbage time, Robert Cope came out of nowhere and had a pretty good game. So there looked like there was some really good, well-executed run plays in that game, and Master Teague looks like a future star.
Master Teague looks like a tank. He does. He looks like when he runs, he looks like he is looking to run somebody over. And that's not on that one touchdown run, he bounced it to the outside, but he certainly looks like he relishes contact. He looks like the kind of guy that in my mind, I'm thinking that, all right, if J.K. Dobbins is carrying the workload, that not only is Master Teague capable of coming in and helping J.K. Dobbins if he needs a breather, but I look at Master Teague as the type that you mentioned late in the game. All right, well, we want to just pound the ball, run the clock on whoever we're playing. Master Teague certainly looks ready, willing, and able to do just that.
I've always loved the guys who really almost go out of their way to, they're running down the sideline. Here comes a cornerback or a safety, and it's like, I'm not going out of bounds. I'm going to be able to smash into this guy. And you think of guys like there's just real physical runners. Not always the biggest guys. Like Walter Payton wasn't a huge running back, but he relished contact, and so did some of the bigger guys like a Herschel Walker or Earl Campbell. But guys like that always sort of bring a smile to your face as a fan, and I think Master Teague is certainly it's hard to tell what he's going to be able to do from the spring game, but he had flashes last year early in the season as well, and I think that he's a player that, like you said, he could step into that sort of garbage time role if J.K. Dobbins is not able to get to grind out yards, and obviously we think DeMario McCall will see some time at running back, but he's not a between the tackles kind of preserve the lead, grind it out kind of running back. So there could be a really nice role for Master Teague this fall.
Yeah, and as far as DeMario McCall, I know all the fans are excited to see him, but the news that DeMario McCall hardly played or didn't play at all in the spring, to me, that just kind of goes back to what I've been saying all along, having seen Damari McCall play in high school, is that I think he is more of, I know he probably chafes at this description, but I really do believe he is more of a third down back. That if he's getting nicked up and it's knocking him out of the spring, because I think that Master Teague has that number 2 spot firmly in his sights, and it won't surprise me if at the end of fall camp, if Master Teague is named the primary backup. I'm not suggesting that Demario McCall won't play.
I certainly don't mind Demario being a third down back because he is good out of the backfield. He's great in the open field. He's a guy who you could hand it to or you could throw it to him. So, one of the problems I had with the offense with Ohio State is, a lot of times you knew exactly what was coming because of either the personnel that the team was in, or you've got a 3rd and 1 and you've taken your running backs completely off the field. So now it's going to be a quarterback run or some kind of pass. There's no option of handing it off or play action or any of that kind of thing. And I've always been a big fan of the play action, Chip. I always think you have to have the threat of a run to keep the defense honest. And obviously the quarterback is a threat to run, especially the JT Barrett years. But it's just one more thing. I mean, if you can fake it to a guy like Master Teague and then follow him through the hole, that's going to be a big chance of success for 1 yard.
And I certainly believe that the play action is going to be a vital part of Ohio State's offensive attack this coming fall, simply because I keep going back to it, but the idea of a predominantly ground-oriented attack, and then you're going to get those safeties creeping up to try and help with run support, and that's where somebody like Justin Fields being able to fake it to a J.K. Dobbins or a Master Teague and then go over the top to hit a wide receiver for a big gain down the field. I certainly think that's going to be something that Ohio State fans will have to get used to, because I think we all got spoiled by Dwayne Haskins last year, and almost everybody that follows Ohio State, for the ozone has been trying to say, hey, Ohio State, that was unusual. We're not going to have that kind of a quarterback this coming year. Based on everything that we saw during the spring game, Justin Fields, he's very talented, but he is very raw, and I think his skill set's completely different than Dwayne Haskins. So that's why I think it's going to be run-oriented, and I think your desire for the play-action passing game is certainly going to be fulfilled.
All right, well, hopefully it will be successful. Chip, anything else we need to touch on about the spring game? Do you want to talk about the Drew Chrisman proposal?
Absolutely, and I sincerely do. I congratulate Mr. Chrisman. I think the young woman's name, I hope I don't get this incorrect. I think her name is Avery Eliason, I think is his fiance's name. Congratulations to the happy couple. I can only speak for myself that when I'm coming up on 19 years of marriage, that I can't even imagine what I was saying is I can't even imagine how nervous that must have been to get down on one knee in front of 61,000 people. I had a difficult time just doing it in front of my now wife. So congratulations to Drew and Avery.
If you pull something like that, Chip, you better be pretty sure the answer is going to be yes.
Yeah, I mean, I also think something that I read online, I think is noteworthy, is after the engagement, somebody made, I saw on Twitter, a comment about after he gets married, let's see how much his wife allows him to flip bottles as much as he that might come to an end after she becomes Mrs. Chrisman.
Well, he posted a video of himself flipping a ring onto her finger on Twitter, I think.
Good for him. I'm happy for him. Like I said, it made for a very happy moment during halftime.
Yeah, so that was great to see, and that's not something I think in a million years you would have seen in the Woody Hayes or Earl Bruce eras.
No, No, if anything, I can't even, I can still imagine the profanity and the steam coming out of their respective ears, like it just, even the thought of such a audacious suggestion.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Chip. Anything else from the spring game that stuck out to you, or that surprised you, or that you want to touch on before we move on?
No, I mean, if anything, I loved going, and I'm, just to kind of reemphasize to all of our listeners to not get too overly concerned about stats and things of that nature. That everything that we've been saying, that I think what you saw in the spring game, I think you'll see, some things that are going to be different in the fall. I wouldn't put too much stock in what you saw in the spring game.
Absolutely. And kudos to the 61,000, yourself included, Chip, for the great attendance. It's, for basically a practice, that's amazing. You don't even get that many fans into some NFL stadiums.
I know. That's the thing. And Ohio State, I give them a lot of credit. The fact that they make the parking free, they allow you to tailgate, all those kind of things. Parking, tailgating, all that kind of stuff. They make it so much easier.
I will say though, Chip, I'm a little disappointed. I was planning to write a grumpy old Buckeye about the spring game, but the pace of the game and the tone of the game made it really hard for me to really be grumpy about anything. So I didn't, I toyed with the idea of doing, why don't they tackle and that kind of thing. But they pulled the grump right out of me for whatever the 2 hours or however long they were on the field in total. So it was interesting. I think people that sort of have gripes about the spring game, sometimes I guess the old school people probably would like to see tackling. They'd like to see regular clock and that kind of thing. But with the fact that some of the offensive linemen had to play for both teams, there's just no good way to do that and have a standard 15-minute quarter with stoppages and all that stuff. It was just never going to happen.
Right, and I'm glad you brought up about like the lines. I think if there is a concern about the spring game, and I know Gerd has written about it, and I've been secretly harboring concern all spring, is just the depth on the offensive line. The fact that Thayer Munford didn't play all spring. I think the offensive line, that in Ryan Day even said that's his biggest concern heading into fall camp. That has to be preeminent, even more so than adding another quarterback. It has to be getting that offensive line settled and cohesive, because if Ohio State can't run the ball and if they can't adequately pass protect, it won't matter who the quarterback is. So getting that offensive line to be in a state of cohesiveness before August 31st, that's going to be the biggest concern all summer.
I would be really surprised, or not surprised, but I would be really interested to hear Ryan Day's answer to that question now that Matthew Baldwin has entered the transfer portal, to see if that's actually true of what his biggest concern would be.
That's fair. Considering he was posed that question at the end of spring practice and probably not anticipating Matthew Baldwin entering his name on the transfer portal. That's a fair question.
Yeah. I think it's telling that neither of us talked about the offensive line, although, again, I did think there were some good holes in the run game, and we didn't really talk about the defensive line too much. We talked a little bit about some of the defensive ends, but the defensive line in general didn't really flash for me, and neither did the offensive line, so maybe that means overall the offensive line played better than I expected, or the defensive line played worse than I expected. Not sure which. Chip, did I lose you?
No, I'm back.
Okay.
Yeah,
right.
It keeps saying like poor connection. I don't know why. So.
Okay. Well, sometimes Skype does things, but
okay.
You don't have to listen to Skype. What does Skype know?
Exactly.
All right, so I think we'll close the book on our spring game discussion. I did want to touch a little bit on the basketball team before we sign off, and I think that the big news And kind of surprising news for me was that sophomore Kaleb Wesson has stated he is going to explore his draft options to go to the NBA. It's possible that he will be back with the Ohio State basketball team next year if he doesn't get sort of the news that he's interested in getting. I don't think that he's going to get a grade of a high draft pick. So it kind of, I know you're not like the hugest basketball guy, Chip, but it would be a pretty devastating loss for Ohio State to lose Kaleb Wesson after Jaden Ledee transferred, and although they did just get a commitment from a 7-footer out of Illinois, but it would be a big loss to lose. They just are coming off a year where they lost their best player in Keita Bates-Diop, and then they would lose their best player yet again with Kaleb Wesson after only his sophomore season.
Well, that is accurate. I mean, I don't follow it as closely as I do the football program. But one thing I am is a strong advocate of anything that is advantageous for the athletes. And correct me if I'm wrong, this is the kind of situation where he can come back to school based on the fact like it is – like I think he's even allowed to hire an agent, but as long as he doesn't take anything from the agent, he's technically eligible. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yeah. There's rules in place where you can actually consult with an agent for this process, and then you can disengage. I think as long as you keep the NCAA and Ohio State apprised of what's going on, I think you can disengage from that relationship and not without being any loss of eligibility.
Yeah, everything I've read online, it seems as though that more than likely he'll be back. I just wish that there were more opportunities like this for other players in football. Like that you could kind of. I know that the NFL does draft grades, but it certainly seems as though as soon as you declare for the NFL draft, I mean your eligibility is gone. Mm-hmm. So this certainly seems much more advantageous for the player. So I wish him well, and I certainly. If the news he gets from the NBA is not to his liking, I certainly hope that he takes advantage of coming back to Ohio State.
Yeah, well, I will say those football players usually when they declare are getting a big fat check from the agent right away off the bat, so they know what they're getting themselves into there, and that's a lot of money. So yeah, it would be great for Chris Holtmann if Kaleb returns. This is a team that's supposed to be sort of breaking into what they're going to become under Chris Holtmann after a couple of years of transition and basically an entire lost recruiting class. So it's very important for Chris Holtmann, if he can get Kaleb back, that would be a huge boost to the 2019-2020 Ohio State basketball season. So good luck to Chris Holtmann.
Absolutely.
Chip, before we sign off, I want to personally thank Pete Hansen for his tenure, 35 years as the Ohio State men's volleyball head coach. He's retiring. The guy was, he ran a good program. He was outstanding. Won some national championships. Really had a good run. He was National Coach of the Year 4 times. They won the national championship, the men's volleyball team, in 2011, 2016, 2017. So very recent success for Hansen, and he is hanging them up and calling it a day.
And as you just said, that's quite a remarkable career, and hopefully a well-deserved retirement. Hopefully that it's going to be happily enjoyed.
Here's the one stat from Pete Hansen that stood out to me, and apologies to you folks who are tuning out because you don't care about volleyball, but if you care about college sports, Pete Hansen had more than 200 academic All Big Ten players.
That's quite impressive.
Yeah, I mean that's amazing. You don't see that in many sports programs. I mean, of any kind. So. Just a really great career for Pete Hansen. 3 national championships. He was National Coach of the Year 4 times, as I mentioned. He had 6 undefeated seasons at home. He won his conference tournament 13 times. Just crazy. 13 NCAA semifinal appearances. I mean, this is like Mike Krzyzewski at Duke kind of numbers.
Yeah, and like you said, it's just the unfortunate reality of the fact that it's a sport that a lot of fans probably do not pay close attention to. But like you said, he certainly had a remarkable career throughout, and in the not so distant past, was leading Ohio State to national championships.
And not honestly, a lot of people that go to Ohio State, a lot of people that went to Ohio State and even follow Ohio State sports won't even know the guy's name. He won 712 matches, so 712 career wins. That's the third most in NCAA history.
I would not have known that.
Yeah, pretty amazing career for Pete Hansen. So enjoy your retirement, Pete, and I hope the program will. The program would be very, very fortunate if they got anyone near his caliber. So, we don't typically talk about the non-revenue sports here on the Silver Bullet podcast. Maybe we should, but it's worthwhile calling somebody out when they have had that kind of a career. So I figured it was worth slipping in.
Absolutely.
All right, Chip. Well, is there anything else you want to discuss at all Ohio State related before we call it a day for this installment of the Silver Bullet podcast?
No, I think just keep our eyes and ears open on the social networks for anything Ohio State football related, as a possible grad transfer quarterback coming in. The NFL draft, we'll be able to, the next time we get together, we'll have an idea as to where players have been selected for the NFL. So we're kind of going into that slow, or at least we presumed was going to be a slow news period up until the news about Matthew Baldwin. So the next time we get together, we'll probably have an idea as to what Ohio State is doing within the quarterback room, as well as the results of the NFL draft.
Yeah, if we had recorded on our normal night, we wouldn't have got the Baldwin news in, and then I think it would have either required a special edition of the Buckeye Weekly podcast, or it would have had to wait almost a week.
Yeah, see, there's the advantage here of kind of, thank you for being flexible. That was something my lovely wife is a CPA, and in terms of, it would be, I didn't mention her coming with us to the spring game because she couldn't. She was working, trying to get, some of her clients' taxes done for the firm that she works for. So, needless to say, within the Minnich household, I think my children are they're probably even happier than I am that my wife is done with tax season. They no longer have to abide their father's cooking.
So you and I, Chip, I think we'll sort of play it by ear and reconvene next month sometime for the next Silver Bullets podcast, and we can talk about the NFL draft and what Buckeyes went where, and what, who do we think has the best chance to stick and that kind of thing, and who didn't get drafted, and look at that moron, he shouldn't have turned pro, and all that kind of thing. We'll have that kind of discussion in our next episode, as well as anything else that comes up, whether there's any transfer news, or anything that comes out of this off season for the football team, and anything else like this Pete Hansen thing that kind of dropped in our laps this week, because we will be going to a more of a monthly schedule until the fall here at the Silver Bullets, because there won't be quite as many things to talk about, and Chip and I both have very busy lives and don't get paid to do this.
Yeah, precisely.
All right, if you want to, you can hit us up on Twitter. I am at Mike36Fan. Chip, why don't you tell them where you can be reached?
I can be reached at Chip Minnich, Minnich. So feel free to shoot Michael and I any kind of questions, comments, suggestions about topics for the podcast. We're certainly open to any and all suggestions.
Absolutely. And you won't see me there anytime soon, but I generally write for the ozone.net on the Hayes and Cannon section, as you do, Chip, and you also have other things you do.
Yes, I also contribute to Athlon Sports. Like I said, it's kind of a slow time, but the good thing is every day it just brings us closer and closer to August 31st when we can actually talk about God's sport on a more frequent basis.
Yeah, I like that, and I like talking about it on a frequent basis. That's always fun too. So yeah, we'll be back to do it again sometime in May. We will put out, the call on our Twitter feeds, and I don't even know who's in charge of the Silver Bullets podcast feed now. Is that still Shannon?
It might be. It very well could be. I know Shannon. There's something that piece of congratulations. He's actually now a full-fledged employee for the Ohio State University. I'm not entirely sure what his official title and responsibilities are, but I know that prior to the spring game on Twitter, Shannon was talking about how he had accepted a new position and was actually moving down to Columbus to work for the university. So congratulations, Shannon.
All right, you can please subscribe to us on the iTunes and leave us your ratings and your feedback, your star ratings and your feedback. Be honest, and we can handle it, and that helps us get seen and heard by more listeners. So if you like what we do, pay it forward, as Woody Hayes would say, and leave us some ratings and reviews. Chip, there's only been one review left since I joined you on this podcast.
Wow. Okay, we gotta get those. We gotta get those back. A little more frequent then.
Yeah, that came back in December of 2018, and it was a 5-star, so that's good.
Okay.
And it says
we just need more of them.
Yeah, it says must listen. Excellent analysis on all things Ohio State, and without bias, all Buckeye fans must listen weekly. So, Chip, please thank your uncle for that nice review.
Will do.
I don't actually know who that was, but thank you. Thank you for the kind words, and that was from OSU Buckeye 049. So,
okay.
So for all we know, it was an actual Ohio State player or former player.
Can only hope.
Yeah, we don't know. All right, that'll do it for us. Please listen to our sister shows, the Buckeye Weekly podcast, of course, with Gerd and Tom Orr, and the Buckeye Sloopcast. I think they're still going in the off season, right?
They are. They're still going strong.
All right, we'll give those guys a listen. I think the Sons of Schmidt are on hiatus. We're going to be monthly for a bit, so we'll see you guys in May. Go Bucks!
Go Bucks!